Welcome, dear viewers. For more exclusive, thrilling stories every week, join our membership. Sit back, relax, and sip your coffee. Enjoy. People ask me why I don't sleep well anymore. They see the bags under my eyes, the way I jump when a car backfires, how I check locks 3 times before bed. What they don't see is September 15th, 2019, playing on repeat behind my eyelids every time I close them. I was a foreman at the Bridger Creek surface mine outside Sheridan then, 23 years old and cocky as hell, thinking I knew everything about coal extraction because my grandfather had worked these same hills back when underground mining was still king. The day it happened, I'd been arguing with my crew chief, Dale Whitehorse, about blasting protocols. Said we could shave 2 hours off the schedule if we set the charges closer together. Dale had this way of looking at you when you were being stupid. Not angry, just disappointed. Like watching a kid touch a hot stove after you'd warned them. Some things got their own timeline, Tommy, he told me. Rushing them just makes everything worse. I should have listened. The blast took out the wrong section of overburden. Instead of exposing the coal seam we'd mapped, it opened up something else, a cavity that had been sealed for God knows how long. 3 of my guys fell through before the dust even settled. Jake Morrison, barely 19, Pete Kowalski, who'd just bought his first house, and Dale. They pulled Jake and Pete out alive. Jake lost his leg below the knee, and Pete still calls me sometimes drunk and crying, asking if I remember the sounds that came out of that hole before the rescue teams arrived. The sounds that definitely weren't human. They never found Dale's body. The mine closed permanently 6 weeks later. Bridger Creek Energy cited geological instability, but the crew knew better. We'd all heard what the rescue teams wouldn't talk about. The scratching sounds echoing up from depths their equipment couldn't measure. The way their flashlight beams seemed to bend and twist when they pointed them down. I spent 3 years after that drinking myself stupid in Billings, taking whatever construction work I could find, and pretending I didn't wake up every night to the memory of Dale's voice, calling my name from somewhere far below. My sister Elena finally dragged me to AA meetings at the Lutheran Church on Grand Avenue. Said I was killing myself slowly. And she wasn't wrong. That's how I ended up in Glen Rock, population 1,526, working the night shift at the old Antelope Creek mine. It's been shuttered since 1987, but Apex Industrial Solutions keeps a skeleton crew there, officially for environmental monitoring and equipment maintenance. The pay is decent. The work is mindless, and most importantly, nobody asks questions about your past. What they do ask is whether you can follow instructions exactly as written, whether you can work alone for 8 hours without getting spooked, whether you understand that some rules exist for reasons you don't need to understand. I thought I could handle it. I thought wrong. The Apex Industrial Solutions office sits in a converted double-wide trailer on the outskirts of Glen Rock, wedged between a defunct Sinclair gas station and Manny's Auto Repair. When I walked in that October morning, the receptionist, a middle-aged woman with graying hair pulled back in a practical bun, looked up from her computer screen with the expression of someone who'd seen plenty of desperate men walk through that door. "You hear about the night position?" she asked before I could speak. "Yes, ma'am. Tell me, Crow Feather. I called yesterday about... I know who you are." She handed me a clipboard thick with forms. "Fill these out. All of them. Don't skip anything, even if it seems personal." The paperwork was extensive. Background check authorization, medical history, emergency contacts, insurance beneficiaries. One section asked about previous exposure to industrial accidents or traumatic workplace events. I hesitated, pen hovering over the checkbox marked yes. Truth's easier to keep track of than lies, the receptionist said without looking up. Her nameplate read, Beverly Spotted Elk. I checked yes and described the Bridger Creek incident in careful, clinical language. Equipment failure, casualties, ongoing psychological treatment. Beverly collected the forms and disappeared into a back office. I could hear muffled conversation, though I couldn't make out words. When she returned, she was carrying a manila folder and a ring of keys that looked older than the trailer itself. Congratulations, Mr. Crowfeather. You start tonight, 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. Sunday through Thursday. Your supervisor is Ray Antelope. He'll meet you at the mine entrance at 10:30 to show you around. She handed me the folder. Read everything in here before your first shift. Memorize it. Ray doesn't like repeating himself, and some of this information could save your life. The drive to Antelope Creek took 20 minutes on Highway 20, then another 10 on a gravel access road that hadn't seen maintenance in years. The mine sat in a valley between two low hills, surrounded by chain-link fence, topped with razor wire. Signs every 50 feet warned against trespassing, with additional warnings in Spanish and what looked like Lakota. Ray Antelope was waiting by the main gate, leaning against a beat-up Ford F-150 that had seen better decades. He was probably in his 50s, weathered face and calloused hands that suggested he'd done real work most of his life. His dark hair was pulled back in a ponytail, and he wore a flannel shirt over faded jeans despite the October chill. "You're early," he said, checking his watch. "Good. Shows respect." He unlocked the gate and we walked toward the main building, a concrete structure that had probably been built in the 1960s, all angles and efficiency with no thought for aesthetics. The windows were boarded up, and rust stains streaked down from the gutters like dry blood. "Company keeps this place running for liability reasons," Ray explained as we walked. "Environmental Protection Agency requires monitoring of old extraction sites. Someone needs to check the methane levels, test the groundwater, make sure the sealed shafts stay sealed." We stopped at a heavy steel door marked "Authorized Personnel Only." Ray selected a key from his ring, an old skeleton key that looked like it belonged in a museum. "Your job is simple. Walk the perimeter every 2 hours, check the monitoring stations, record the readings, radio in your status every hour on the hour. Most importantly, follow the rules in that folder Beverly gave you." The door opened into a small office with a desk, filing cabinets, and a bank of monitoring equipment that hummed quietly in the corner. A large map of the mine complex covered one wall, with red X's marking sealed entrances and yellow dots indicating sensor locations. Ray pointed to a thermos on the desk. "Coffee's already made. Should last you through the night. There's a microwave if you bring food, but the refrigerator doesn't work anymore." He pulled out a heavy flashlight and a two-way radio, both looking military surplus. "Flashlight's got fresh batteries. Radio's channel 7. I monitor from home most nights, but sometimes I drive by to check on things." "How long has the mine been closed?" I asked. "Officially? 38 years, but there have been caretakers here the whole time. Some last longer than others." Ray's expression grew serious. "The last guy quit without notice, just left his keys on the desk and drove away, didn't even collect his final paycheck." He showed me the perimeter route, a path that wound around the main complex, past 3 sealed shaft entrances and a cluster of storage buildings. The entire circuit took about 40 minutes at a steady pace. "Stay on the path," Ray emphasized. "Don't go near the old equipment yards after midnight. Don't approach Shaft 7, even if you hear sounds coming from it. And whatever you do, don't respond to anyone calling your name unless you can see who's speaking." That last rule made my stomach tighten. "What kind of sounds?" "The kind that make you think someone needs help." Ray looked directly at me. "They don't." He handed me the keys and headed for his truck. "Read those rules tonight. All of them. Beverly wasn't exaggerating. They could save your life. As his taillights disappeared down the access road, I stood alone in the Wyoming darkness, listening to wind move through the abandoned structures. The folder in my hands felt heavier than it should have, and I found myself thinking about Dale Whitehorse's voice calling my name from that hole in Sheridan. Some things have their own timeline, he'd said. I was beginning to understand what he meant. Back inside the office, I settled into the worn desk chair and opened Beverly's folder. The first page was typed on an old typewriter, the kind that left slightly raised letters on thick paper. At the top, someone had handwritten, "Night Shift Protocols, Antelope Creek Facility," in careful block letters. Rule 1. Complete perimeter walk every 2 hours, starting at midnight. Follow the marked path exactly. Do not deviate for any reason. Rule 2. Radio check-in every hour on the hour using the phrase, "Night Eagle, all stations clear." Wait for confirmation before proceeding with duties. Rule 3. If you encounter another person on the grounds between 11 p.m. and 5 a.m., do not engage in conversation. Return to the office immediately and radio for instructions. Rule 4. Should you hear your name called, verify the source visually before responding. If no source is visible, ignore completely and continue with assigned tasks. Rule 5. The storage buildings in grid sections C and D are off-limits after midnight. Approach these areas only during daylight hours or in emergency situations. Rule 6. Shaft 7 monitoring station readings must be recorded every 4 hours. Approach no closer than the designated safety line, marked in yellow paint. If the methane detector shows readings above 15 parts per million, evacuate immediately and contact emergency services. Rule 7. Between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m., remain inside the office building. Monitor systems remotely during this period. Do not conduct perimeter walks during these hours under any circumstances. Rule 8. If you observe lights or movement near the sealed shaft entrances, document the time and location, but do not investigate. Include this information in your shift report. Rule 9. The employee break room refrigerator has been disconnected. Do not attempt to restore power to this appliance. Rule 10. Should you hear mechanical sounds, digging, drilling, or heavy machinery during your shift, note the time and approximate direction. These sounds are normal and require no action on your part. The rules felt both specific and vague, like someone had learned them through trial and error rather than corporate policy meetings. At the bottom of the page, someone had added in different handwriting. These rules exist because people died ignoring them. Follow them exactly. RAI. Checked the wall clock. 11:47 p.m. 13 minutes until my first perimeter walk. The monitoring equipment hummed steadily, displaying numbers that meant nothing to me yet. Green lights blinked in steady patterns across 3 different panels. I found a logbook next to the radio and flipped through previous entries. Most were routine. Temperature readings, methane levels, equipment status. But scattered throughout were oddities that made me pause. October 3rd, 2:30 a.m. Heard digging sounds from northeast quadrant. Duration approximately 20 minutes. No visual confirmation possible due to Rule 7 restrictions. September 28th, 4:15 a.m. Movement observed near Shaft 2. Appeared to be single individual, but too distant for positive identification. Logged per Rule 8th, September 15th, 1:45 a.m. Radio malfunctioned during check-in. Heard voice on channel claiming to be base station, but voice pattern didn't match Ray's. Ignored per Rule 4 guidelines. September 15th. The same date as the Bridger Creek accident. I wondered if that was coincidence or if something about that particular day attracted trouble. At midnight exactly, I grabbed the flashlight and radio, locked the office door behind me, and started my first walk. I looked at the display. The numbers had stabilized at 14.9 ppm, just 1/10 of a point below the evacuation trigger. 14.9 and holding, I reported. Stay at the safety line. Do not approach the shaft. If it hits 15, get out of there immediately and head back to the office. Copy. Ray, there are other sounds out here, like something digging. A long pause. Rule 10, Tommy. Document and ignore. But there's an open building in grid section D and... Tommy. Ray's voice carried a note of warning. Follow the rules exactly. Document everything in your shift report, but don't investigate. You understand me? I looked at the methane display one more time. Still 14.9, but the underground sounds were growing more distinct. What I'd taken for mechanical noise was resolving into something else. Something that sounded almost like voices, lots of them, speaking in unison far below. I understand, I told the radio, though I wasn't sure I did. The walk back to the office took 25 minutes, and I spent every one of them fighting the urge to look over my shoulder. The sounds followed me part way, then faded as I reached the main building. By the time I locked the door behind me, the night had returned to its previous quiet. I documented everything in the logbook: the forced building door, the methane spike, the underground sounds. But writing it down didn't make it feel any less real, any less like standing at the edge of that hole in Sheridan 3 years ago. Some things have their own timeline, Dale had said. I was starting to think my timeline had led me right back to the edge. The hour between 1 and 2 a.m. passed quietly. I monitored the equipment panels, recording readings that seemed routine after the earlier excitement. Methane levels across all sensors had stabilized. The underground sounds had stopped completely. Even the October wind had died down, leaving the facility wrapped in stillness that felt heavy rather than peaceful. At 1:47 a.m., I started my second radio check-in. Night Eagle, all stations clear. I spoke into the handset. Static answered me. I waited 30 seconds and tried again. Night Eagle, all stations clear. More static, but this time I caught something underneath. A voice so faint I couldn't make out words. It might have been Ray responding from home, or it might have been interference from a truck on the interstate 20 miles away. Ray, are you there? This is Tommy with hourly checking. The static cleared suddenly, and a voice came through with perfect clarity. Copy that, Tommy. All quiet on this end. How are things at your location? Something about the response bothered me. Ray had answered my call earlier with, Copy that, Tommy. But his speech pattern had been different, more casual, with the slight pause he used when thinking through his words. This voice sounded crisp, professional, like a dispatcher or radio operator. I checked the logbook entries I'd read earlier. September 15th, the previous night shift worker had noted a similar issue with voice patterns not matching Ray's during radio calls. Things are good here, I said carefully. Completed first perimeter walk. All readings normal. Excellent. Continue with regular protocols. The radio went quiet. I sat staring at it for several minutes, replaying the conversation. The voice had been clear, but there was something artificial about it. Not robotic exactly, but like someone reading from a script rather than speaking naturally. Rule 4 echoed in my mind. Should you hear your name called, verify the source visually before responding. If no source is visible, ignore completely. Did that apply to radio communications? The rules hadn't specifically addressed that scenario, but the principle seemed relevant. I made a note in the logbook about the unusual radio response and decided to be more cautious with future check-ins. At 2 a.m. exactly, Rule 7 kicked in. I was supposed to remain inside the office building until 4 a.m., monitoring systems remotely. The equipment panels would have to serve as my eyes and ears for the next 2 hours. I settled back in the desk chair and opened the thermos Ray had prepared. The coffee was strong and bitter, with an aftertaste that reminded me of campfires and old tobacco. It warmed me from the inside, pushing back against the chill that had been creeping into the office, despite the building's heating system. 20 minutes later, the phone rang. The sound made me jump so hard I knocked over my coffee cup. I hadn't even noticed there was a phone in the office, an old rotary model sitting on a filing cabinet, the kind with a bell, loud enough to wake the dead. I let it ring 4 times before picking up. Antelope Creek facility. Silence on the other end, but not dead air. I could hear breathing, slow and steady, like someone listening carefully. Hello? I tried again. Tommy. The voice was barely above a whisper, but I recognized it immediately. Dale Whitehorse. My hand started shaking so badly, I nearly dropped the handset. Dale had been dead for 3 years, his body lost somewhere in the depths of Bridger Creek Mine. There was no way he could be calling me. Who is this? I managed. Tommy, you need to listen to me. You're in danger. The voice was perfect. Dale's slight accent, the way he pronounced my name with emphasis on the first syllable, even the concerned tone he'd used when warning me about safety protocols. This isn't real, I said aloud, though I wasn't sure if I was talking to the caller or trying to convince myself. The things down there, they're not what you think. They're not what the company thinks either. They've been waiting, and now they know you're here. I thought about Rule 4 again. Verify the source visually. There was no way to visually verify a phone call, which meant I should ignore it completely. But this was Dale's voice, and Dale had tried to warn me before. Maybe he was trying to warn me again. What things? I asked. The old stories call them skin takers. They live in deep places, places where the earth has been wounded. Mining operations, especially coal mines, they create perfect conditions, dark, deep, lots of places to hide. My coffee cup had shattered when it hit the floor, and the liquid was seeping into cracks between the concrete tiles. I focused on that detail, trying to anchor myself in something real and immediate. Tommy, are you listening? I'm listening. I can take voices, appearances, memories. They study people, learn to mimic them perfectly. But they make mistakes sometimes. Little things, speech patterns, timing, details that don't quite match. Like the radio call earlier, I thought. The voice that sounded like Ray but felt wrong somehow. How do I know you're real? I asked. The line went quiet for so long, I thought the connection had been lost. Then Dale's voice came back, softer now, sadder. You don't. That's the whole problem, Tommy. Once they start copying people you know, you can't trust anything anymore. Not voices on the radio. Not people you meet on the perimeter. Not even your own memories after a while. The phone went dead. I sat holding the handset until the dial tone became unbearable, then hung up and walked to the window. Through the boards covering the glass, I could see thin lines of light from the security lamps scattered around the facility. Everything looked normal, quiet, exactly as it should at 2:30 a.m. But Dale's words kept echoing. Skin takers. Things that lived in wounded earth, in places that had been dug too deep, disturbed too much. I thought about the Bridger Creek accident. The cavity we'd opened that shouldn't have existed. The sounds the rescue teams wouldn't discuss. The way Dale's voice had called my name from depths their equipment couldn't measure. Had something followed me here? Or had I simply found another place where the same kinds of things lived? At 3 a.m., I tried my regular radio check-in. Night Eagle, All stations clear. Copy that, Tommy. Everything quiet there? Ray's voice, but I listened carefully this time. The slight pause was there, the casual tone, the way he dropped the G from everything. It sounded right, felt right, matched my memory of our earlier conversations. All quiet, I confirmed. No issues to report. Good deal. Stay warm in there. Temperature's supposed to drop tonight. That sounded like Ray, too. The kind of small talk a supervisor might make to keep a nervous employee calm during their first night shift. But then I remembered what Dale had said about them making mistakes with details. Was Ray's concern about temperature real? Or was something else testing my responses, learning my patterns? I spent the next hour analyzing every sound the building made around me. The heating system cycling on and off, electrical panels humming, wind finding its way through gaps in the exterior walls. All normal sounds, but after the phone call, everything felt potentially suspect. At 4 a.m., Rule 7 expired. I was free to resume perimeter walks, but the idea of leaving the office's relative safety made my stomach clench. Still, the rules existed for reasons I didn't need to understand, according to Beverly. Following them exactly had kept other night shift workers alive. I gathered my equipment and stepped outside. The facility looked different somehow, though I couldn't immediately identify what had changed. The security lights were all functioning. The buildings stood in their proper places. The paths remained clear and well marked. But something felt off about the proportions, like looking at a photograph that had been slightly stretched or compressed. Distances seemed wrong. The storage buildings appeared closer than they should be, while the sealed shafts felt farther away. I started the perimeter walk anyway, following the reflective markers that glowed in my flashlight beam. The first monitoring station showed normal readings. Shaft 1's concrete cap remained undisturbed, though the scratch marks I'd noticed earlier seemed deeper, more extensive. At the grid section, these storage buildings, the forced door I discovered on my first walk was now closed and padlocked again. The padlock looked identical to the one I'd found twisted apart and lying on the ground. Same manufacturer, same design, even the same serial numbers. But the hasp was intact, the metal showing no signs of damage or stress. I documented the observation in my logbook, though I wasn't sure what to make of it. Had someone come by during my 2-hour confinement to repair the door? Ray hadn't mentioned any other personnel working nights, and the rules specifically warned against encountering other people on the grounds. The path led me past Shaft 2 and Shaft 3, both sealed and quiet. But as I approached Shaft 7, I could see that the methane monitoring display was lit up like a Christmas tree. Red numbers blinked urgently. 18.7 parts per million. Well above the 15 parts per million evacuation threshold. I grabbed my radio. Night Eagle, this is Tommy. Shaft 7 showing 18.7 ppm methane. Evacuating area immediately. Static answered me. I tried again. Night Eagle, emergency at Shaft 7. Methane levels critical. Please respond. More static, then a voice. Copy, Tommy. Readings show normal here. Are you sure about your numbers? The voice sounded like Ray, but something nogged at me. I looked at the display again, still blinking 18.7 ppm in angry red digits. Display shows 18.7, I repeated. Bright red, blinking. That's odd. Remote monitoring shows 12.2, well within normal range. Might be a local sensor malfunction. I stared at the display, trying to process the discrepancy. Either my equipment was malfunctioning, or the remote monitoring system was wrong, or someone was lying to me about what they were seeing. Should I evacuate the area? I asked. Use your judgment, Tommy. If the local sensor shows dangerous levels, follow protocol. Better safe than sorry. That sounded like something Ray would say, but the phone call with Dale had made me question everything. I backed away from Shaft 7, staying well beyond the yellow safety line, and continued the perimeter walk from a distance. As I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from the sealed shaft entrance. Something that had learned to mimic voices and repair broken locks, and manipulate monitoring equipment to suit its purposes. Something that was very patient and very interested in the new night shift worker who'd brought his own particular set of wounds and fears to the Antelope Creek facility. The rest of my perimeter walk passed without incident, though I found myself checking over my shoulder every few steps. By the time I returned to the office, it was 4:47 a.m., and my nerves felt frayed as old rope. I locked the door behind me and slumped into the desk chair, grateful for the solid walls around me. The equipment panel showed steady green lights across all systems. Whatever had caused the methane spike at Shaft 7 had apparently resolved itself, or the remote monitoring system was telling the truth about normal readings. I no longer trusted my ability to distinguish between the two possibilities. I was updating my shift report when I heard footsteps outside. Slow, measured steps on gravel, circling the building. I checked my watch. 4:52 a.m., still within the time frame when encountering other people violated Rule 3. The footsteps stopped directly outside the office door. 3 soft knocks echoed through the room. "Tommy, you in there?" Ray's voice muffled by the steel door but clearly recognizable. I sat frozen, pen halfway through writing a sentence about the methane readings. Rule 3 was explicit. If you encounter another person between 11 p.m. and 5 a.m., return to the office immediately and radio for instructions. But I was already in the office, and the person outside claimed to be my supervisor. "Tell me it's Ray. Open up. We need to talk." The voice sounded exactly right. Ray's tone, his speech patterns, even the slight rasp from years of cigarettes. But the phone call with Dale had taught me to question perfect mimicry. I picked up the radio instead of approaching the door. "Night Eagle, this is Tommy. Are you currently at the facility?" Static, then, "Negative, Tommy. I'm at home. Why do you ask?" The voice on the radio was identical to the voice outside the door. Same person, same inflection, same everything. But they couldn't both be Ray, which meant at least one of them was something else. The knocking resumed, more insistent now. "Tommy, I know you're in there. I can see the lights. Open the door." "Ray, if that's really you outside, what did you tell me about the storage buildings earlier tonight?" A pause. Then, "I told you to stay away from them after midnight. Grid sections C and D are off limits during certain hours." That was correct, but it was also information anyone could have overheard during our initial conversation. I needed something more specific, something only the real Ray would know. "What was your advice about some things having their own timeline?" Another pause, longer this time. I don't recall saying that, Tommy. Are you feeling all right in there?" That was wrong. Ray hadn't said those words. Dale Whitehorse had 3 years ago at Bridger Creek. But the real Ray would have said he didn't remember, or asked for clarification. He wouldn't have claimed not to recall something he'd never said in the first place. The thing outside was guessing, filling in gaps with responses that sounded reasonable, but weren't quite accurate. "Tommy, you're scaring me here. Open the door so we can talk face to face." I kept the radio keyed and spoke loudly enough for both versions of Ray to hear. "Ray, the person at my door claims to be you, but they gave an incorrect response to my verification question. What should I do?" The radio crackled. "Stay inside. Lock the door. Do not engage with whoever is out there." The knocking stopped abruptly. Through the boarded windows, I caught a glimpse of movement, a shadow passing by one of the gaps between boards. But instead of continuing around the building, the footsteps headed away from the office, toward the sealed shafts. I stayed at the radio. "Ray, are you monitoring from home?" "Yes. I've got remote access to most of the security systems. I can see the perimeter cameras from here." "What do the cameras show?" "Nothing unusual. Some thermal signatures near Shaft 7, but that could be equipment warming up as the underground temperature changes." Equipment warming up. That seemed like a reasonable explanation, but I wondered if Ray was seeing what I'd seen, or if the cameras were showing him something different. The gap between local and remote monitoring was becoming a consistent theme. "Should I continue with regular protocols?" I asked. "Stick to the rules, Tommy. Whatever's out there, the rules exist because they work." At 5 a.m., the restriction on encountering other people lifted according to Rule 3. But I wasn't eager to resume perimeter walks after the door incident. Instead, I focused on monitoring the equipment panels and updating my shift report. The incident log was becoming extensive. Forced building door that repaired itself. Methane readings that conflicted between local and remote sensors. Phone call from someone claiming to be a dead colleague. Radio communications with inconsistent voice patterns. And now a visitor impersonating my supervisor. Either I was having some kind of breakdown, or the Antelope Creek facility was home to something that enjoyed psychological manipulation. At 5:15, I heard an engine approaching. Through the window gap, I watched headlights sweep across the facility as a vehicle navigated the access road. The engine sound was familiar. Ray's old Ford F-150, with its distinctive exhaust rattle. The truck parked near the main gate, and Ray Antelope climbed out. He walked toward the office with the steady gait I remembered from our earlier meeting, and when he knocked on the door, it was a brisk professional rap rather than the slow, deliberate knocks from an hour before. "Tommy, it's Ray. How was your first night?" This voice carried the subtle differences I'd learned to recognize, the casual pronunciation, the slight hesitation between words, the warmth that suggested genuine concern rather than scripted responses. I unlocked the door and let him in. Ray looked tired, like he'd been awake for several hours despite the early morning arrival. His flannel shirt was wrinkled, and his hair had come loose from its ponytail. "Rough night?" he asked, glancing at my shift report. "You could say that. Did you get my radio calls about the methane readings?" "Some of them. Radio reception's been spotty lately. We might need to upgrade the equipment." Ray poured himself coffee from a second thermos he'd brought. "Walk me through what happened." I described the evening's events in chronological order, watching Ray's face for reactions. When I mentioned the phone call claiming to be Dale Whitehorse, his expression grew serious. "Dale was your friend at Bridger Creek?" "My crew chief. He died in the accident that got me transferred here." Ray nodded slowly. "The things that live in deep places, they feed on guilt and trauma. Strong emotions leave impressions, like scents that attract predators. If you've been carrying grief about your friend's death, they'll use that against you." "So the phone call wasn't real?" "Probably not. But that doesn't mean the information was useless." Ray sat on the edge of the desk. "Traditional stories talk about entities that mimic voices and appearances. They're patient hunters. They study their prey for weeks or months, learning everything they can before making their move." "What kind of move?" "Depends on what they want. Sometimes they're just hungry for attention, for someone to acknowledge their existence. Sometimes they want to trade places with a living person. And sometimes..." Ray's voice trailed off. "Sometimes what?" "Sometimes they want to collect people. Add them to whatever community exists in the deep places. Turn them into something similar." I thought about the sounds I'd heard during my first perimeter walk. voices speaking in unison, far underground. How long have they been here? Hard to say. The Antelope Creek mine went deeper than most operations in this area. 17 levels at its peak, with exploratory shafts that went even further down. When they sealed it in 1987, they were dealing with more than just economic problems. Ray finished his coffee and stood up. The good news is that following the rules keeps you safe. They're based on decades of experience with these entities. As long as you stick to the protocols exactly, you'll be fine. And if I don't, then you end up like the last guy who worked this shift, or the one before him, or any of the others who thought they knew better than the people who wrote those rules. Ray collected his thermos and headed for the door. Get some sleep, Tommy. You've got 4 more nights this week, and they'll probably test you harder now that they know you're here. After he left, I sat alone in the morning silence, thinking about what he'd said. The entities were patient hunters. They studied their prey. They used guilt and trauma as bait. I brought plenty of both to the Antelope Creek facility. The question was whether I could follow the rules well enough to survive whatever they had planned for me, or whether I'd end up adding my voice to that underground chorus I'd heard on my first night. Some things have their own timeline, Dale had said 3 years ago. I was beginning to understand that my timeline might be running out faster than I'd realized. I drove back to my apartment in downtown Glenrock as the sun climbed over the Laramie Mountains, painting the October sky in shades of amber and rust. My studio rental sat above Murphy's hardware store on Birch Street. Nothing fancy, but it had thick walls and a door that locked properly. After the night I'd had, those features felt more important than square footage or kitchen amenities. Sleep didn't come easily. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard Dale's voice on that phone, or the sound of deliberate footsteps circling the office building. When I finally drifted off around noon, my dreams were full of deep places and voices calling my name from darkness I couldn't measure. I woke at sunset feeling worse than when I'd gone to bed. The shower helped somewhat, as did the burger and fries I grabbed at Donna's Diner on 2nd Street. But as I drove back toward Antelope Creek for my second night shift, anxiety sat in my chest, like a stone. Ray was waiting at the main gate again, leaning against his truck with a thermos of coffee and what looked like a manila envelope. "How'd you sleep?" he asked as I parked beside him. Like someone who spent 8 hours wondering if every sound was real. Ray nodded with understanding. "It gets easier. Your mind learns to filter out the noise after a few weeks." He handed me the envelope. Additional protocols. Things I should have given you on your first night. But I wanted to see how you handled the basic rules first. Inside were 3 typed pages, same format as the original rules, but with different handwriting in the margins. These annotations looked older, like they'd been added by multiple people over several years. Supplemental protocols, night shift. Rule 11. If you hear children crying or calling for help anywhere on the facility grounds, do not investigate. Children should not be present at this location under any circumstances. Note in margin, they sound real. They sound hurt. Don't listen. MK 1994. Rule 12. Should you encounter someone claiming to be a previous night shift worker, verify their identity using personal information not contained in personnel files. Do not trust identification cards or uniforms. Note in margin, Jake Morrison worked here 2018 to 2019. If you see him, run. He's been gone for 3 years. RA. Rule 13. Between the hours of 1 a.m. and 3 a.m., monitor the facility's main phone line. If it rings more than 3 times without stopping, disconnect the line at the junction box located behind the office building. Note in margin, after the 3rd ring, it's not a phone call anymore. DS 1998. Rule 14. Do not attempt to communicate with entities through writing, gestures, or any means other than direct speech. They interpret written communication as invitation or agreement. Note in margin. This includes notes, symbols, or marks left for you to find. Ignore them completely. RA, Rule 15. If you observe your own vehicle in the parking area while you are inside the office building, do not approach it. Radio for immediate evacuation. Note in margin. Saw my own truck 3 times before I figured out what it meant. Still not sure how I got home those nights. Anonymous. I read through the supplemental rules twice, noting how they addressed increasingly specific and disturbing scenarios. Someone had learned these lessons through experience, probably multiple people over many years. These are all based on actual incidents? I asked. Every single one. The margins tell you what happened to the people who learned these rules the hard way. Ray looked tired. Some of them are still working here in a sense. Others, he gestured toward the sealed shafts. We walked to the office together. Ray unlocked the door and performed a quick inspection of the equipment panels while I prepared my gear for the night ahead. One more thing, Ray said as he prepared to leave. The entities you're dealing with here, they're not malicious in the way humans understand malice. They're following their own nature, like predators hunting prey. They don't hate you personally, but they will use every advantage they can find, including my memories of Dale, especially those. Guilt makes people predictable. It makes them want to believe things that feel like redemption or closure. Ray paused at the door. Dale Whitehorse died in an industrial accident. Whatever called you last night might have sounded like him, but it wasn't him. Don't let them use your grief as a weapon. After Ray left, I settled into what was becoming a familiar routine. Equipment check, logbook review, thermos preparation. The monitoring panels hummed their steady rhythm, all readings normal. Outside, October wind moved through the abandoned structures with a sound that might have been singing if you weren't listening carefully. At midnight, I began my first perimeter walk of the second night. The path felt different somehow. Not physically changed, but charged with potential energy like the air before a thunderstorm. My flashlight beam seemed dimmer despite fresh batteries, and the reflective markers that guided my route appeared to flicker when I wasn't looking directly at them. The first monitoring station showed normal methane levels. Shaft 1's concrete cap remained sealed and undisturbed. But as I approached the grid section storage buildings, I noticed something that made me stop. A child was sitting on the steps of Building C. A little girl, maybe 7 or 8 years old, wearing a faded blue dress and no shoes despite the October cold. She had long, dark hair that hung over her face, and she was crying quietly. The kind of heartbroken sobbing that makes adults drop everything to help. Rule 11 blazed in my memory. If you hear children crying or calling for help anywhere on the facility grounds, do not investigate. Children should not be present at this location under any circumstances, but seeing her sitting there, alone and afraid in the middle of a Wyoming night, every instinct I had screamed at me to help. She was so small, so obviously in distress. "Mister?" she called without looking up. "Mister, I'm lost. I can't find my mommy." Her voice carried perfectly across the distance between us, clear and sweet despite her tears. It was the voice of a child in genuine need, and ignoring it felt like the cruelest thing I'd ever done. I forced myself to continue walking, following the perimeter path around the storage buildings rather than approaching her directly. But as I moved, she kept talking. "Please, mister, it's cold out here. I've been waiting so long for someone to help me." I looked over my shoulder. She was standing now, one small hand extended toward me. Her face was still hidden by her hair, but something about her posture suggested hope mixed with desperation. My mommy said someone would come. She said the nice man with the flashlight would take me home. That stopped me cold. How could she know about the flashlight? How could her mother have known I'd be here? "Mister, please, just look at me. I won't hurt you." Rule 11 said children should not be present at the facility under any circumstances, which meant this wasn't really a child, or it was a child that had been taken and changed into something else, or it was something that had never been human at all. I keyed my radio. "Night Eagle, this is Tommy. I have a situation at grid section C." Static answered me. I tried again. "Night Eagle, requesting guidance on Rule 11 implementation." More static. The radio was working. I could hear the carrier wave, but no one was responding. Either Ray wasn't monitoring tonight, or something was interfering with communications. "Mister, why won't you look at me?" I turned my flashlight beam toward the child. She was still standing on the steps, but her posture had changed. Instead of the dejected slump of a lost child, she stood perfectly straight, perfectly still. Her extended hand remained frozen in place, like a statue's gesture, and I realized I couldn't see her shadow. My flashlight was pointing directly at her, bright enough to illuminate details of her dress and the concrete steps beneath her feet. But she cast no shadow on the wall behind her, no distortion of light that would indicate a physical presence. "Look at my face, mister. Please look at my face." There was something different about her voice now. Still a child's voice, but with an undertone that reminded me of the underground sounds I'd heard on my first night. Multiple voices speaking in unison, creating harmony that shouldn't have been possible from a single throat. I started walking again, faster this time. The child followed along the fence line as I continued my perimeter route, always staying exactly the same distance away, always maintaining that unnaturally perfect posture. "You can't ignore me forever, mister. Eventually, you'll have to look." She was right, and that terrified me. Rule 11 said not to investigate children on the grounds, but it didn't address what to do if they followed you. How long could I complete my duties while pretending not to see something that was obviously present? At Shaft 2, I checked the monitoring station. Normal readings, but as I recorded the numbers, I caught movement in my peripheral vision. The child had moved closer, now standing just beyond the yellow safety markers that surrounded the sealed entrance. "This is where my friends live," she said conversationally. "Deep down where it's always dark. They've been waiting for so long to play with someone new." I finished recording the readings and continued walking. Shaft 3 was clear, but at Shaft 7, the methane monitors were acting up again. The display flickered between normal readings and dangerous levels, numbers scrolling too fast to track accurately. "The air tastes different when you're scared," the child observed. She was standing directly between me and the monitoring station now, forcing me to walk around her to complete my duties. I gave her a wide berth and approached the sensor array from an angle that kept her out of my direct line of sight. But as I reached for my logbook, she spoke again. "Tommy," my name in a child's voice, but pronounced the way Dale Whitehorse used to say it, emphasis on the first syllable. Slight pause between the double consonants. "Tommy, you need to look at my face now." I grabbed my radio and tried every channel, hoping to reach someone, anyone who could provide guidance. Channel 7 was static. Channel 8 was static. But on Channel 9, I heard something that made my hands shake. My own voice, calling for help. "Night Eagle, this is Tommy at Shaft 7. I need immediate evacuation. There's something wrong here. Something that shouldn't exist." It was my voice, my speech patterns, my exact pronunciation. But I wasn't transmitting. My radio was set to receive, and the voice was coming from somewhere else. Please respond, Night Eagle. I'm trapped out here with something that looks like a child but isn't human. It won't stop following me. The transmission continued for several minutes, describing events that were happening to me in real time, but from a perspective I wasn't broadcasting. Somewhere else in the facility, something was mimicking my voice and reporting my situation to an empty radio frequency. The child laughed, a sound like bells mixed with the scraping of metal on stone. Now you're learning, she said. We practice your voices when you're not listening. We get better every time. I finished at shaft 7 and headed back toward the office, walking as fast as I could without running. The child kept pace effortlessly, sometimes appearing ahead of me on the path, sometimes trailing behind, but always maintaining that same impossible posture and shadowless presence. At the office door, I fumbled with my keys while she stood 10 feet away, watching with her face still hidden behind dark hair. See you tomorrow night, Tommy, she said as I got the lock open. And the night after that, and the night after that. I slammed the door behind me and engaged both locks. Through the boarded windows, I could see her small figure outlined against the security lights, standing motionless in the parking area. She remained there for the rest of my shift, never moving, never changing position. At 7 a.m. when Ray arrived, she was gone. But when I looked at my logbook to write the incident report, I found new writing in the margins, childish handwriting in crayon that shouldn't have existed. Tommy looked at me tonight. He'll look again tomorrow. And tomorrow, I'll show him my face. I haven't looked at her. I've been careful to avoid direct eye contact the entire time. But something had convinced her otherwise, which meant the rules I was following weren't the only rules in play at the Antelope Creek facility. Ray knocked on the door. How was night 2? I opened the locks and let him in, then handed him the logbook with its new crayon edition. Ray read the margin note and nodded grimly. They're escalating faster than usual. That's not a good sign. What does it mean? It means they've decided you're worth the effort to collect. And once they make that decision... Ray's voice trailed off as he studied the childish handwriting. Once they make that decision... What? Once they make that decision, Tommy, the rules stop being about survival and start being about buying time. The third night, I arrived at the facility to find Ray already there, along with someone I didn't recognize. An elderly Shoshone woman sat in a folding chair beside Ray's truck, braiding sweetgrass with practiced fingers. She wore a heavy wool coat and traditional beadwork that caught the security lights like scattered stars. Tommy, this is my grandmother, Rose Antelope, Ray said as I approached. She knows more about the things that live in deep places than anyone else in Wyoming. Rose looked up from her braiding, studying my face with dark eyes that seemed to see more than I was comfortable sharing. You've been carrying grief for a long time, she said. Not a question. Yes, ma'am. These entities, they feed on old wounds that haven't healed properly, like infection in a cut that keeps getting reopened. She stood, moving with the careful dignity of someone whose joints had earned their stiffness. Ray tells me they're escalating their attention toward you. I nodded, thinking about the child's crayon message in my logbook. Show me your hands, Rose said. I extended both hands, palms up. Rose examined them closely, tracing lines and calluses with one weathered finger. You work with your hands, but you've been pushing paper recently. Used to carry weight, but you've been carrying guilt instead. She looked directly at me. The man who died at your other job, he was important to you. Dale was my crew chief, my friend. I should have listened to his warnings about the blast patterns. And now something wearing his voice calls to you from dark places, offering forgiveness you think you don't deserve. The accuracy of her observation hit me like a physical blow. How did you? Because I've seen this pattern before. Many times. Rose returned to her braiding. These entities study their targets for weeks before making contact. They know exactly which emotional wounds to exploit. Ray unlocked the facility gate. Grandmother wants to perform a cleansing ceremony before your shift, something to strengthen your resistance to their influence. Will it keep them away? No, Rose said simply. But it might help you remember who you really are when they try to convince you otherwise. We walked to the office building together. Rose carried a beaded leather pouch and a bundle of sage that filled the October air with earthy fragrance. Inside the office, she moved around the room in a pattern that seemed both random and purposeful, leaving small piles of herbs at specific locations. This won't last forever, she explained as she worked. The entities will find ways around spiritual protection eventually, but it should buy you some time to figure out what they really want. Don't they want to collect me? That's what Ray said. Rose paused in her preparations. Ray's right, but that's not the whole story. These particular entities have been trapped here since the mine closed. They can influence the surface world, but they can't leave this location. They need something from the living world to break that confinement. What kind of something? A willing exchange. Someone who chooses to trade places with them, to take their confinement while they take that person's freedom. Rose lit a bundle of sage and began moving smoke around the room with an eagle feather. They've been working toward that goal for 37 years. Have they succeeded before? Ray and Rose exchanged a look. 3 times, Ray said quietly. The night shift workers who disappeared over the years. We think they made the exchange, but we can't be certain because there's no record of them leaving Wyoming. Their vehicles were found abandoned, their bank accounts untouched, their families left without explanation. And the entities? Hard to tell. If the exchange worked, then 3 of these things are walking around somewhere in human form, living human lives while their victims remain trapped underground. The implications of that possibility made my stomach clench. How many people across Wyoming might actually be skin-taking entities wearing stolen identities? Rose finished her cleansing ceremony and packed her materials. The protection will hold for tonight, maybe tomorrow night too. After that, you'll be on your own again. What happens if I refuse to make an exchange? Then they'll keep escalating until you break, or until you violate enough rules that they can take you without requiring consent. Rose looked directly at me. Free will is important to them, for reasons we don't fully understand. But they're very good at creating situations where terrible choices seem like the only options available. After Ray and Rose left, I sat alone in the protected office space, trying to process what I'd learned. The entities wanted a willing exchange, my freedom for their confinement. And they'd been working toward that goal for nearly 4 decades, using night shift workers as their primary targets. I wondered about the 3 who had disappeared. Had they been presented with impossible situations that made trading places seem reasonable? Had they been convinced that sacrifice would somehow balance the scales for past mistakes? At midnight, I began my 3rd night's perimeter walk. The difference was immediately apparent. The oppressive weight I'd felt during previous nights was reduced to a tolerable pressure. Rose's protection held, creating a buffer between me and the entity's direct influence. But they were still present. At the first monitoring station, I found a new message scratched into the metal housing. Tommy, we miss talking to you. At Shaft 1, someone had arranged small stones in a pattern around the concrete cap, not a random scattering, but a deliberate design that hurt to look at directly. The child from the previous night stood at the grid section storage buildings, but she remained at a distance, watching without approaching. Her posture had changed from yesterday's perfect stillness to something more natural, more human. But she still cast no shadow under the security lights. "The old woman's magic smells like burning leaves," she called across the distance. "It won't last long." I ignored her completely and continued the perimeter walk. At Shaft 2, I found my own jacket hanging on the monitoring station. The same jacket I was currently wearing. Same brand, same color, same wear patterns, but somehow duplicated and placed there for me to find. Rule 15 flashed through my memory. If you observe your own vehicle in the parking area while you are inside the office building, do not approach it. Radio for immediate evacuation. The rule specifically mentioned vehicles, but the principle seemed applicable to any duplicate of something that should only exist once. I radioed for guidance. "Night Eagle, this is Tommy. I found a duplicate of my personal clothing at Shaft 2, requesting instructions." Ray's voice came back clearly. "Do not touch it. Continue your route and document the location. We'll dispose of it after your shift." "Copy that." But as I walked away from Shaft 2, I heard footsteps behind me, the steady rhythm of someone wearing boots identical to mine. I didn't turn around to look, but the sound followed me all the way to Shaft 3. The methane monitors at Shaft 7 showed stable readings, but the display case had been covered with handprints, dozens of them, different sizes, pressed against the glass from the inside. Small child hands, adult hands, and some that seemed too large, or had too many fingers to be entirely human. I documented everything in my logbook, noting locations and times with clinical precision. But documenting strange events didn't make them feel less real, less threatening, less like a coordinated campaign to undermine my sanity. Back at the office, I reviewed the night's observations. The entities were probing Rose's protection, testing its limits without directly confronting it. They'd created duplicates of my possessions, left messages, and maintained surveillance through the shadowless child, but they hadn't attempted direct contact since the cleansing ceremony. At 2 a.m., Rule 7 confined me to the office building. I settled into the desk chair and tried to focus on monitoring equipment readings, but my attention kept drifting to the boarded windows and the darkness beyond them. That's when the phone rang. Not the slow, deliberate ringing from 2 nights ago, but rapid, urgent pulses that seemed almost frantic. I let it ring 3 times as specified in Rule 13, then waited for it to stop. It didn't stop. 4 rings, 5, 6. The sound was becoming physically painful, like an ice pick jabbed into my eardrums with each pulse. According to the supplemental rules, anything after the 3rd ring wasn't really a phone call anymore. I had to disconnect the line at the junction box behind the office building, but that meant leaving the office during Rule 7 hours, which violated the fundamental protocol about staying inside between 2 and 4 a.m. The phone continued ringing. 7 rings, 8, 9. The sound was affecting the monitoring equipment now. Displays flickering, readings jumping randomly, electronic interference spreading through every system in the office. 10 rings, 11, 12. I grabbed my flashlight and headed for the door, weighing the violation of Rule 7 against the clear need to stop whatever was happening to the phone line. Some situations required choosing between conflicting rules, and this seemed like one of them. The junction box was exactly where Ray had indicated, mounted on the rear wall of the office building. Inside the metal housing, I found the main phone line and disconnected it with shaking fingers. The ringing stopped immediately. But in the sudden silence, I heard something else. Voices calling my name from multiple directions, coming from the sealed shafts scattered around the facility. Tommy! Dale's voice from Shaft 1. Tommy! My own voice from Shaft 7. Tommy! The child's voice from the storage buildings. Tommy! Voices I didn't recognize from shafts I couldn't identify. A dozen different calls, overlapping and echoing, creating a chorus that seemed designed to pull me in multiple directions at once. Rose's protection held, but I could feel it weakening under the coordinated assault. The entities were throwing everything they had at me during Rule 7 hours, when I was supposed to be safely confined to the office. I ran back to the door and found it locked. My keys were inside, sitting on the desk where I'd left them. The door had somehow locked itself while I was dealing with the junction box, trapping me outside during the most dangerous hours of the night shift. The voices calling my name grew louder, more insistent, coming from every sealed shaft simultaneously. In the distance, I could see figures moving between the buildings, shadowy forms that might have been previous night shift workers, or entities wearing their faces, or something else entirely. Rose's protection was failing. The entities had forced me into a situation where I had to violate multiple rules simultaneously, weakening the spiritual barrier she'd created. And now I was trapped outside, surrounded by things that had been planning this moment for weeks. Tommy, came Dale's voice from directly behind me. You need to listen to me now. You're in real danger. I turned around to find Dale Whitehorse standing 3 feet away, looking exactly as he had 3 years ago at Bridger Creek. Hard hat, safety vest, the concerned expression he wore when warning people about dangerous shortcuts. This isn't real, I said aloud. Of course it's real, Tommy. Just not in the way you think. Dale looked exactly as I remembered him. Weathered face from years working outdoors, calloused hands, the way he held his shoulders slightly forward from decades of bending over equipment. Even his voice carried the right inflection, the slight rasp from cigarettes he'd quit 5 years before the accident. You're not Dale, I said, backing away from the office door. Dale died at Bridger Creek. I did die there, Tommy, but death isn't the end of everything, especially not in places where the earth has been wounded. He gestured toward the sealed shafts. These entities you've been dealing with, they're not the only things that live in deep places. The distinction felt important somehow. What else lives down there? People who fell through cracks in the world. People who got trapped between what was and what is. Dale's expression grew sad. I've been trying to warn you for 3 years, Tommy. Ever since you started blaming yourself for something that wasn't your fault. Around us, the other voices continued calling my name from various locations across the facility. But Dale's presence seemed to create a bubble of relative calm, a space where conversation was possible despite the chaos. The entities Ray told you about, they want to make an exchange, Dale continued. Your freedom for their confinement, but they can't force that choice. You have to make it willingly. And if I don't, then they'll keep escalating until you break, or until you violate enough rules, but they can take you without consent. Dale looked toward the locked office door. They've been planning this moment for weeks. Force you outside during Rule 7 hours. Surround you with threats. Make the exchange seem like your only option for survival. The child appeared at the edge of the security lights, still maintaining her distance, but close enough that I could see her more clearly. She was perfectly proportioned, perfectly detailed, but something about her was fundamentally wrong, like a photograph that had been printed with the wrong color settings. She's not real either? I asked. She's real, but she's not what she appears to be. None of them are. Dale moved closer, and I caught the scent of coal dust and machine oil that had always clung to his work clothes. Tommy, I need you to understand something important. The guilt you've been carrying about my death, it's not justified. I should have listened to your warnings about the blast patterns. You were 23 years old and eager to prove yourself. I was the experienced foreman. If anyone should have stopped that blast, it was me." Dale's voice carried the patient tone he'd used when teaching younger workers about safety protocols. "But the truth is, that cavity we opened wasn't created by our charges. It was already there, waiting. Our blast just happened to break through." The revelation hit me like cold water. "What do you mean?" "The Bridger Creek accident wasn't caused by human error, Tommy. It was caused by something that had been hibernating in those deep places for decades, maybe longer. When we broke through the rock that contained it, it woke up and needed fresh territory." Dale pointed toward the sealed shafts. "It followed you here because you carry the psychic scent of that awakening. These entities recognize you as someone who's already been touched by their kind." The voices calling my name were getting closer, and I could see figures moving between the buildings, indistinct shapes that might have been human, but walked with gaits that seemed slightly off, slightly wrong. "How do I get out of this?" I asked. I decided to stay inside and monitor remotely until dawn. The equipment panels could provide most of the information I needed to complete my shift report, and the rules didn't specifically require leaving the office between 4 and 7 a.m. At 5:30, my radio crackled to life. "Tommy, this is Ray. I'm getting some unusual readings on the remote monitors. Is everything all right out there?" The voice sounded exactly like Ray, but after the night's events, I wasn't taking any chances. "What kind of readings?" I asked. "Seismic activity around Shaft 7. Small tremors, but consistent, like something moving around down there." That matched what I had observed during my earlier walks, the underground sounds that suggested large-scale movement in the sealed mine system. "The entities have been more active tonight," I reported. "They forced me outside during Rule 7 hours, but I made it back to the office." "Forced you outside, how?" I described the phone emergency and the mysteriously locked door. Ray listened without interruption, then asked several specific questions about timing and sequence of events. "They're getting desperate," he concluded. "Usually they take months to reach this level of direct confrontation. The fact that they're escalating so quickly suggests they see you as particularly valuable." "Why would I be more valuable than previous night shift workers?" "Because you've already been touched by their kind. The Bridger Creek incident created a psychic connection that makes you easier to influence and harder to replace." Ray's voice carried a note of concern. "Tommy, I need you to be extra careful for the rest of this week. If they can't convince you to make an exchange willingly, they might try to force the issue." "How would they do that?" "By creating a situation where all your choices lead to the same outcome, where every rule violation, every mistake, every moment of weakness brings you closer to their goal." The radio went quiet for a moment, then Ray continued. "Grandmother's protection won't last much longer. After that, you'll be dealing with their full attention with no spiritual buffer. Are you prepared for that?" I looked around the office, at the equipment panels humming steadily, at the logbook filled with increasingly strange incident reports, at the thermos of coffee that had kept me anchored to ordinary reality throughout 3 nights of extraordinary events. "I don't know," I admitted, "but I'm not ready to give up yet." "Good. That's what I wanted to hear." Ray's voice carried approval mixed with worry. "Hang in there, Tommy. Dom's less than 2 hours away." As if responding to his words, the first pale hint of sunrise appeared through gaps in the boarded windows. The entities retreated from approaching daylight, but I could feel their attention like weight pressing against the office walls. They weren't finished with me yet. Not by a long shot. I never worked a 4th night at the Antelope Creek facility. When Ray arrived at 7 a.m., I was sitting in my truck in the parking lot with my resignation letter already written. The office keys sat on the passenger seat beside a manila envelope containing my incident reports from 3 nights of escalating supernatural encounters. "You sure about this, Tommy?" Ray asked as I handed him the materials. "I'm sure. Those things down there, they're not going to stop, and I'm not willing to make the trade they want." Ray nodded with what looked like relief. Probably the smartest decision any night shift worker has made in the past decade. "What happens now? Do you find someone else?" "We'll go back to remote monitoring for a while. It's not as effective, but it's safer than feeding more people to whatever's living in those sealed shafts." Ray looked toward the office building. "Eventually, we'll have to deal with the problem permanently, but that's a conversation for people with more authority than I have." I drove away from the facility that morning feeling lighter than I had in years. The guilt about Dale's death hadn't disappeared completely, but talking with his echo had helped me understand the difference between responsibility and blame. Sometimes terrible things happen despite everyone's best efforts. That afternoon, I called Elena to tell her I was leaving Wyoming. "About time," she said without surprise. "You've been running from ghosts long enough. Maybe it's time to start living with living people again." I spent 2 weeks in Going Rock tying up loose ends, then loaded my belongings into my truck and headed east. I didn't have a specific destination in mind, just a need to put distance between myself and the deep places where wounded earth harbored things that fed on guilt and trauma. I ended up in Nebraska, working construction in Lincoln. It's honest work with honest people. And nobody asks about my past or why I sometimes wake up in the middle of the night listening for voices calling my name from dark places. But I kept in touch with Ray through email and occasional phone calls. 6 months after I left, he told me they'd found another night shift worker, a young Lakota man named Joseph Crow Dog, who'd lost friends in a pipeline accident and needed work that didn't ask too many questions. "He lasted 2 weeks," Ray wrote. "Smart kid. Followed the rules exactly, documented everything properly, then quit when he realized what he was dealing with. Left a note saying no job was worth trading his soul for." A year later, Apex Industrial Solutions abandoned the Antelope Creek monitoring contract entirely. The facility sits empty now, surrounded by razor wire and warning signs in 3 languages. The sealed shafts remain sealed, but Ray tells me the entities are still there, still waiting. "Sometimes we get reports from truckers on Highway 20, he explained during our last phone conversation. Lights moving around the facility at night, sounds carrying across the valley. Nothing that requires official investigation, but enough to remind us that some problems don't solve themselves." I asked if he thought the entities would eventually find a way out. "Maybe, but that's not my problem anymore, and it's definitely not yours. You made the right choice, Tommy. Some debts aren't worth paying." These days I sleep better than I have in years. The nightmares about Bridger Creek have faded to occasional bad dreams, and I've stopped jumping at unexpected sounds. I even started dating someone, a teacher named Maria who knows about my past, but doesn't treat me like damaged goods. But sometimes, late at night when the Nebraska wind moves through the apartment complex, I hear something that might be my name carried on air currents from 1,000 miles away. When that happens, I check my locks twice and remind myself that some things have their own timeline, and mine led me away from the deep places before it was too late. I don't know what became of the 3 night shift workers who disappeared over the years, or whether they're still trapped in chambers far below the Wyoming hills. I hope they found peace somehow, in whatever form peace takes for people caught between worlds. As for me, I'm learning to live in the daylight again. It's a good place to be.